Now I want you to make me host.
Done, sir.
Done. Okay, fine. Are you able to see me? Are you able to see my visual?
Hello.
Are you able to see my visual?
Yes, sir. Okay.
My visual is not shown. Are you
Yes,
able to
sir.
listen to me?
Yes, sir. Audible, sir.
Shall I start?
Yes, sir.
Shall I start?
Yes, sir. Start. Please start.
Okay, dear students, how are you? I hope you will be doing well. Today we are Ramanujan. He talked about unity of various cultures. We all know that India has various cultures. In every state, you'll find a different culture of India. And he talks about the unity of the cultural diversities of India. Let's look at the biographical sketch of A.K. Ramanujan. He was a poet, translator, folk lyricist, linguist, and philologist. Philologist means a person, but natural, a literary person, someone who studies the cultural part and the historical part of the languages. A.K. Ramanujan was born in Mysore, India. He earned degrees at the University of Mysore and Deccan College in Pune, and he received his doctorate from Indiana University. He wrote in both English and Kannada. His poetry is known for its thematic and formal engagement with the promotion of the union of cultural heritage, prominently in such collections as the Striders, Selected Poems, and the Second Side. Most important part about his poetry is he talked about the unity of cultural heritage of India. The collected poems of A.K. Ramanujan received the Sahitya Akademi Award after the author's death. As a scholar, Ramanujan contributed to a range of disciplines, including linguistics and cultural studies. His essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?, proposed a notion of context sensitive. When we talk about sensitiveness, when we talk about sensitivity, we generally associate it with emotions, with feelings. But he talked about being sensitive in different situations, contextual sensitiveness. And he laid emphasis on universal concepts and structures. Context sensitive thinking influenced Ramanujan as a folk lyricist as well. His works of scholarship include The Interior Landscape, love poems from a classical Tamil anthology. Anthology is a collection of poems. Folk Tales from India, a selection of oral tales from 22 languages, and A Flowering Tree and Other Oral Tales from India. He was also a writer of tales, and his tales were focused on different aspects of culture of our country. For much of his career, Ramanujan taught at the University of Chicago, where he helped develop South Asian Studies program. He remained a visiting professor to the University of Hyderabad. In 1976, the Indian government honored him with the title Padam Shri, the fourth highest civilian award in the country. So friends, you need to remember this. This is a very important fact about A.K. Ramanujan, that is received the fourth highest civilian award of the country, that is Padam Shri. Ramanujan's others honors included a MacArthur Fellowship. The South Asian Council of the Association for Asian Studies also awarded A.K. Ramanujan. So this is about the awards received by this great person. A.K. Ramanujan is one of the leading Indo-Anglian poets. Students, Indo-Anglian means Indian writer writing in English. Indo-Anglian is a term which is used for an Indian writer writing in English. He was one of the leading Indo-Anglian poets and sometimes considered as one of the big three poets in India. Big three poets. Now you must be thinking about the other two ones. The other two are R.K. Narayan and R.K. Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand. R.K. Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand and A.K. Ramanujan, these three were the big guns of Indian English literature. The range of Ramanujan's poetry is limited, but there are certain qualities in his poetry that makes him unique poet of Indian English poetry. When we read his poetry, we find the impact of Sangam poetry of Tamil language. He wrote in Kannada also. So we find that element, Tamilian element in his works, and there was a great impact of Sangam poetry of Tamil language in his works. In his poetry, family is a theme of most of his poems. He also talks about the Hindu heritage. He was a poet who wrote many things about Hinduism. He not only talks about the qualities and positive points of Hindu heritage, but also talks about the book inability of Hindu faith to satisfy the modern mind. He laid emphasis on the point that many Hindus don't read their scriptures, their religious books, and this inability of not reading the books of Hindus was quoted by him in his works. Ramanujan describes that the Gita teaches us to remain calm at the time of crisis. He gave an important lesson of Gita in his works. Gita teaches us, the famous book of Hindus, the Bhagavad Gita teaches us to remain calm, even when you are facing adversities. And this theme, this lesson, this moral of Bhagavad Gita was highlighted by him in his works. Historical sensibility is another important quality of the poetry of Ramanujan. He also dealt with some historical perspective, and he sensitized people about the historical perspective of our country. Small scale reflections on a great house, the last of the princes, and prayers of the Lord Murugan are some of his poems that describe his historical sensibility. Friends, you need to remember these poems. These poems were centered on historical sensibility. He also wrote some love poem for a wife, still life, and looking for a cousin on a swing may be regarded as love poems. His love poems celebrate love as a abiding experience, everlasting experience. Apart from that imagery, psychological realism, physical violence, and the psychosis are the other qualities of the poems of Ramanujan. Ramanujan dealt with the psychological realism also. He also picturized, he also painted the psychology of the people, psychology of Indians, and his psychology was seeped in realism. He also wrote about the violence, the physical violence taking place in the country, and he created various images in his poems to depict what he wanted to. Ramanujan's command over English idioms and languages and his grasp over the essence of Indian wisdom and worldview has been acknowledged by his contemporaries. His contemporary poets always appreciated him for his terrific command over English language and his grasp over Indian wisdom. He has brought out his outlook towards life in the poem The Hindu. He does not hurt a fly or a spider either. He talks about Hindus' way of life. He talks about what is written in Hindu religion, that is, a Hindu does not hurt even a fly or a spider. Explaining his belief in the unity of life, Ramanujan has traced it to the ancient myths through apt images and irony. Two literary tools were quite famous with him. He used many images and he used irony as a tool to convey his feelings. Ramanujan's poetry brings out the prominent characteristics of not only the Indian poetry in English but also the modernist poetry. His poetry creates a blend of Indian English poetry, and he also takes into account the modernism. The concept of modernism is very much highlighted in his poems. Ramanujan's contribution in the development of Indian poetry in English reflects the basic aspects of Indian social life. We can say that he was a social poet. Social consciousness was his forte, and he talked about society at length, at large. Ramanujan's poetry is a depiction of human sentiments, feelings, and emotions in a direct way without any sophistication. He depicts human life from different angles. He talks about different emotions, different feelings, different sentiments, reactions of the people, reactions of Indians towards different situations. There are no traces of alien influences on his poetry. In spite of his long stay abroad, he spent a lot of time outside India, but in his poetry, you will find pure Indianness. He was Indian at the core level. Nowhere in his poetry you will find that his poetry has technical excellence and bears the stamp of his individuality. Ramanujan's poetry is never pedantic. He's not pedantic. He's not Pandit like. His poetry is not full of rules. He was not a conventional poet. He wrote the poems in his own way. His style was different from the rest of the poets of India. He was not verbose. He was not someone who was bound with the rules and regulations of composing poems. He wrote all his poems in a language which is crisp, intense, and casual. Poetry should be everybody's teacup. He followed that notion. In his poem, The Striders, in order to draw the attention of the reader, he has introduced even ambiguity. Ambiguity also he has defined. Perhaps he was the only poet, he is the only poet who has introduced ambiguity. Ambiguity he has defined. The words create a rhythm and form which enhance the value of his poetry. The poems of Ramanujan are finely crafted pieces and the words shine with the depth of meaning. Ramanujan has laid equal stress on the meaning as well as design of each poem. If you go through all the poems of Ramanujan, you will find that he has adopted different styles of writing. You will come across different styles of writing in his poems. The designer poems of Ramanujan are not only a treat to the eye, but also indicate a multi-layered meaning. You'll find multi-layered meaning in various lines which he has penned in his poems. To identify the central theme of Ramanujan's poems, one has to proceed cautiously with patience and imagination. Ramanujan's poetry has brought many laurels to him. The volumes of his poetry, the striders, relations, and selected poems have been praised by the literary critics for the concise expression and originality. His concise expression won various hearts, and his originality was tremendous. It was appreciated by various people, and he was appreciated all over India for that. Ramanujan has done a yeoman's service, a great service, by translating the Tamil and Kannada classical poetry into English. He was also into translation. He translated various Kannada classical poetry into English. His stress on the web of family life and the integration of the individual with it remains the prominent characteristic of his poetry. His poetry was also famous in a way that he talked about family life, how to lead a family life, and he also talked about one's integration with the family, how an individual is integrated with the family. He also laid emphasis on that. The collection of poems in relations reflect his poetic insight mingled up with its Eastern and Western cultures. His poetry, you will find that he talks about cultures of the East and cultures of the West. He says that with the passage of time, the individual is prone to see the law of karma in all changes around him. He believed in the notion, in the philosophy, in the moral, in the value of the Bhagavad Gita, that work is worship. And that's why he talked about karma in most of his poems. Ramanujan's use of irony is most evident in the poem Entries for a Catalogue of Fears. Irony, friend, irony means to say something which means otherwise. When something otherwise happens, that's called irony. And you'll find the ironical strokes played by him in his poems. And Entries for a Catalogue of Fears is the famous one as far as the ironical tool is concerned. Even at the advanced age of 60, instead of having total faith in God, one may talk now and then of God. He also talked about faith in God. What happens? People should have complete faith in God, but there are people who do not believe in God. There are people who don't have faith on God. He also talked about the same. He said that God is supreme and we must have total faith in God, complete faith in God. He says in the same poem that double vision is confusing with no clarity of things in the external world. But with one small adjustment of glasses, all the misunderstanding vanishes. He says that confusion, misunderstanding occurs in life because we are not making small adjustments. Small adjustments. Small adjustments can create better understanding in our lives. On very petty things, we fight and misunderstanding is created. He says that misunderstanding can be avoided if we make small adjustments. The mystification of events due to the lack of scientific approach and empirical analysis produce a host of problems which are hurdles in the path of progress. He says that scientific approach is needed, analysis is needed to tackle with the problems of life. There are various problems coming in our lives. Problems come in the path of progress, and to fight with the problems, you need a scientific approach and empirical analysis. The poetry of Ramanujam is like a mirror in which one can see the face of Indian tradition along with a host of other things. His poetry recognizes the vitality inherent in Indian culture and tradition, and also the changes which have taken place in the structure of Indian society. He talks about the changes that have taken place in the structure of Indian society. Ramanujan's subtle irony colors his glimpses into the traditional ideas and rituals, which are followed by people belonging to different strata of Indian society. His irony is the biggest tool, and his irony is colored with the glimpses of traditional ideas and rituals. He talks about the tradition and rituals followed by people of different levels, people of different walks of life. His poetry has presented the diverse aspects of tradition in a new garb, new chola, new dress, which is also indicative of the need to distinguish between the relevant and irrelevant aspects of it in the context of changes in the contemporary world. He wanted to bring about the change in society, and so he clearly distinguished between the relevant and irrelevant aspects of life. Ramanujan's poem, Self Portrait, shows his excellent grasp over the use of images to depict the experiences and emotions in his poetry. He has brought out his innermost feelings and the assessment of his own personality and its different facts in it. Ramanujan's two collections of poetry, The Striders and Relations, have a unique place in the corpus of Indian poetry in English. The interest and deep attachment of Ramanujan to the past events as well as history is depicted in The Striders and Relations. The poems in these two works provide an outline of his approach towards people and the predicament faced by them in the past and also in the world of today. He recaptures the past events very clearly, very lucidly. He describes the events of his early years spent with his father, mother, and grandparents. In several poems, he has mentioned his role in the family and analyzed his inner feelings and sentiments. For Ramanujan, the past is not an amorphous entity. Generally, people think that past has nothing to do in life, but he spoke about the significance of past. Past is not a useless thing. He said, past is substantial to correlate with the tempo of life in the current world. Many writers, many poets say that past is meant for analyzation. Whatever mistakes you did in past, thinking over those mistakes, thinking over those problems, you can calculate, you can plan and come up with some strategies to overcome those problems. So past is an inspiring time, and he perhaps wanted to say the same. He says that without knowing the linkages of the past, one cannot grasp the reality of living present. If you want to know about the living present well, you need to know the past as well. While asserting the importance of the following norms of the contemporary world, Ramanujan likes to derive solace from the traditions and beliefs of the ancient world. Ramanujan's poetry reflects his deep insight into the cultural patterns of both East and West. The ancient wisdom of India gains a new relevance in the poetry of Ramanujan amidst the conflicts in the present world. His poetry became a solace, became a matter of comfort for many ailing hearts of the contemporary society. He has analyzed the human situation through the combined vision of the East and West. He wanted to see the unison, the unity of East and West. The Indian perspective and experience towards the human problems finds a prominent place in the poetry of Ramanujan. It is through appropriate images that he has depicted the human situation, contradictions, and complexities experienced by the people. His poetry is a synthesis of the best literary traditions of the India and the Western world. The combination of the Indian and Western elements has added a new sheen to his poetry. His focus is on several unexplored areas of human life which are generally neglected today. His poetry concentrates on the innermost sentiments of the people, both in the Indian and Western society. Poets have no sympathy towards the suffering of fellow beings. He was a poet of common man. He was a poet of he was pained to see that the poets, some of the poets, do not look at the sufferings of downtrodden, underdogs. In the poem A River, he has indicated how during the flood period, the river becomes an instrument of destruction. The huts are washed away, and people living on river banks have to face acute suffering. He has no respect for persons who are not inclined to share the sufferings of others in their hour of crisis. He says that the new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant women drowned and perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. Poets talk about different things, but no one speaks about the sufferings of pregnant women, the torments of life faced by the underdogs. Ramanujan is a keen observer of socio-political events and has exposed the voracious dealings of the who are voracious by nature, greedy by nature. In every dealing, they have some greed. He observed that, and he has exposed that in his poems. The images of cannibals and screaming worms bring out the strategy of some politicians. Cannibals, human beings who eat other human beings. The image of cannibal is given to politician. They remove the rivals from their path and play their criminal games without any sympathy for the welfare of the masses. Ramanujan has protested against the monopolists and dictators who have no respect for human values. He prefers to follow the values embedded in Hindu worldview. He is against accepting the socio-political systems which negate the human values enshrined in civilization of the world. World civilization talks about peace, talks about values. And he said, Hindu viewpoint is centered on that. The characteristics of Indian family are reflected in the poetry of Ramanujan along with diverse themes. The integrated relationship within the family organization have been conveyed by Ramanujan in his poetry. He has pointed out that within the family, the individual gains protection, stability, and strength. Otherwise, he would have been like a hunted deer on the white salt land. This is what he says in relation. Without family, no existence. An individual gains protection in the family, stability in the family, and strength in the family. The different facets of life in a close-knit family have been described by Ramanujan. In the poem of Mothers, among other things, he has dealt with the changes in the life of his mother. The deterioration in his mother's health with the passage of time leaves her a shadow of the former self. Ramanujan has a positive approach towards all problems. He does not like the escapist tendencies in persons. He is not escapist. He has the courage to face the challenges and adversities. That is something positive which he highlights in his poems. Positive approach towards life, not afraid to face challenges and adversities. His poem 1, 2, maybe 3 arguments against suicide brings out the loftiness of life and emptiness of death. Sushant Singh Rajput must have studied this poem. He says, only that person is bent on suicide who has no guts to meet the hostile situations. He affirms that suicide is no answer to the problems of life. And one who attempts suicide will end in facing a mere odorless, fragranceless soul, a see-through man-shaped hole in the air, a late lamenting ghost looking in vain for an empty seat. If someone commits suicide, then the soul of that person is going to get nothing. Rather, that soul is going to face very bad experience. One of his poems, A River, what is there in river. The poem is centered around the city, Madurai, which is the city of temples and poets. Vegai is the river which flows near the city of Madurai. The poem mainly focuses on the impact of the river on the lives of people who live near the bank of the river Vegai. The poem is divided into 4 uneven stanzas. The first stanza contains 16 lines, second 11 lines, third 7 lines, and fourth has 15 lines. The poem is full of imagery. Flood, rain, and river are the 3 major images in the poem. The poem describes the coldness of the new poets towards harsh reality of the things that they have romanticized. Generally, poets try to romanticize the river, the natural objects, and Ramanujan sees something beauty of the river and then tells how it kills the people every year at the time of the flood. River is both the poets living in the city write poems about the city and temples. Poems also contain accounts of how every summer a river flowing through the city of Madurai is reduced to a narrow stream, and how soon afterwards it is flooded with the water of the rains. During summer, it gets converted into a stream, a narrow stream. But what happens afterwards? It is flooded with the water of the rains. When it is reduced to a narrow stream, its water cannot pass through the water gates because of the piles of straw and women's hair which obstruct its flow. The bridges over the river are marked with many patches of repair. Those stones of the bridges which begin to shine while the dry stones retain their original dull color. The poets merely write poems about the floods in the river. A visitor once happened to spend one day in Madurai when a flood in the river was imminent. He heard people everywhere talking about the level of the water rising quickly. The people talked about the water rising over the steps leading to the river and the water rising on the bathing places. He also heard people talking about the damage done by the water that has swept away 3 village homes, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows. But no one wrote anything about pregnant woman who has drowned in the flood. The pregnant woman perhaps carried 2 babies in her womb and perhaps felt them kicking against her walls of her womb before they could come into this world. How pitiable it is. How paining it is. The visitor said that there was enough water in the river to inspire the poets to compose the poems. He also said that the flood carried away 3 village houses and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda and 1 pregnant woman expecting to give birth to twins with no moles on their bodies. Thus, 3 lives might have been lost in the flood. This is the story which is repeated every year. Every year this happens. Anxiety, another poem. This poem describes the nature of anxiety, or to be more accurate, it points out the indescribable nature of the anxiety. Things can be defined or described in specific terms, either in a straightforward way or by the use of similes and metaphors. But anxiety is a state of mind which cannot be described in direct terms. It is the frustration of contemporary times which leads to anxiety. The source of the anxiety is individual. Mind it, the source of anxiety is individual. Internal environment matters. In the first 12 lines of the poem, Ramanujan tries to describe anxiety by means of various similes and metaphors. But not feeling satisfied with them, he says in the last 2 lines that anxiety can find no metaphor to end it. He uses metaphors and similes, but in the end of the poem, he says no metaphor can end the anxiety. Thus, in Ramanujan's case, anxiety is a perpetual state of mind. Ramanujan in this poem shows himself as a pessimist poet. His gloomy nature is indicated clearly in the lines in which he says that anxiety has loose ends with a knot at the top. That's me. The poem refers to the complex Indian problems like growth of population, poverty, illiteracy, and problem of unemployment, and many more. Fear is the source of all the tension of the poem. Fear exists, maybe because of communal conflict, Maoism, and terrorism. Those may be because of the wrong policies of the government and wrong administration. But all the blames cannot be passed to the government only. It's because of the lack of individual consciousness. That's why the poet says that the anxieties are with a knot at the top. That's me. In the end of the poem, pigeon appears as symbol of happiness and peace. The poet suggests that anxiety will not end, but we should keep ourselves happy. Anxiety will not end, but we should keep ourselves happy. Thank you very much.